The Galactic Coalition had a problem that no one wanted to talk about, and that problem floated in 17 containment pods scattered across the darkest corners of space. They called them the Vethkai, and they were the most terrifying things ever created by intelligent life in the known universe. Massive creatures of living shadow and quantum fire, designed 3,000 years ago to eat stars and burn entire solar systems down to ash and silence. Back then, the Coalition had needed weapons to end a war that threatened to destroy everything, and so they had made monsters on purpose, engineering them from the DNA of extinct apex predators and dark matter and things that science still could not fully explain. The war ended, as all wars eventually do, but the Vethkai remained. For 3 millennia, they floated in stasis, a threat held over the heads of any species that might think about starting trouble again. The ultimate deterrent, the final word in any argument. About power. But here was the problem that kept Admiral Kethros awake during his sleep cycles. The handlers were all dead. The original species that could survive proximity to the Vethkai had gone extinct 2,000 years ago, and every attempt to train new handlers from other species had ended in disaster, madness, death, or both. The containment pods were old and getting older, and someday they would fail. And then the Coalition would have 17 uncontrolled galaxy killers, loose in the universe with no way to stop them. Admiral Kethros stood before the Dominion Oversight Council, his forearms clasped behind his back as he presented his desperate proposal. "We send one Vethkai to the humans," he said, and the chamber erupted in noise. The humans were the newest species in the Coalition, having achieved faster than light travel only 50 years ago. They were strange and confusing and did things that made absolutely no sense to anyone. Their psychologists called them broken in ways that defied explanation. They kept predators as companions. They touched venomous creatures for fun. They formed emotional bonds with anything that moved and many things that did not. They domesticated wolves, Admiral Kethros continued when the noise died down, and turned them into animals that sleep in their beds and eat from their hands. They keep reptiles that could kill them as pets. They cry when their machines break down because they gave them names and loved them. A counselor from the Vethma Collective raised a trembling appendage. "To speak, you want to give a galaxy killer to a species of psychological deviants? I want to see what happens." The Admiral replied, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had run out of better options. "At worst, we lose one orbital station, and the humans learn some humility. At best, perhaps their madness is exactly what we need." The vote passed by a narrow margin, and the containment pod began its journey to Earth. Commander Sarah Chun had served in space for 20 years, and she thought she had seen everything the universe could throw at a person. But watching her crew evacuate Armstrong Station made her stomach tight with fear. Every species on board had fled the moment they learned what was coming. The Kethver diplomatic team had practically trampled each other getting to their shuttle, and even the brave warriors of the Dexan Empire had made excuses about urgent business elsewhere. Only the humans remained. Containment pod entering Docking Bay 7 announced the station's computer, and Sarah watched on the monitors as the massive black sphere settled into place with a hum of energy fields. Specialist Marcus Webb stood beside her, a cup of coffee in his hand and curiosity on his face, rather than the terror that any sensible person should feel. Marcus was 43 years old, with gray streaking his brown hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Before joining the Coalition Xenobiology Division, he had spent 15 years as a veterinary technician in Wisconsin, treating everything from cows to wolves to one very angry badger that had bitten him 3 times. Beginning release sequence, the computer announced, and the containment pod began to open. Sarah had read the files and studied the images and watched the historical recordings. but nothing could have prepared her for seeing a HFY in person. It unfolded from the pod like a nightmare made real, a mass of writhing darkness that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could process. Quantum fire flickered along its form in colors that had no names. And when it opened its eyes, there were far too many of them, burning with the light of consumed stars. It screamed. The sound hit Sarah like a physical force, and she grabbed the console to keep from falling. Her vision blurred, her ears rang, and for one terrible moment she could taste the color purple and hear the smell of burning ozone. Other species would have gone mad from that scream. The HFY's cry operated on frequencies designed to shatter sanity and crush the will to resist. But humans were stubborn creatures who did not break the way they were supposed to. Sarah shook her head to clear it and looked at Marcus, expecting to see him crouched on the floor or running for the exit. Instead, he was staring at his datapad with a frown on his face. "Commander," he said, and his voice was calm in a way that made no sense. "Look at these readings. Its cortisol analogs are off the charts, and its neural activity is showing patterns I usually see in traumatized animals." Sarah blinked at him, still dizzy from the psychic assault. "Specialist Webb, that thing just tried to drive us insane." "Yes, ma'am, and I think it did that because it is terrified out of its mind." He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that she recognized. It was the same look he got whenever he saw a stray animal in the station's corridors. The same stubborn compassion that made him spend his off hours building shelters for creatures that most people considered pests. "Commander, the Coalition treated these things as weapons for 3,000 years. Has anyone ever asked what they actually feel?" Sarah opened her mouth to give a sensible answer about protocols and safety and not anthropomorphizing alien-killing machines, but the words died in her throat. On the monitor, the HFY had retreated to the corner of the docking bay, its massive form pressed against the wall as containment fields pulsed around it. It looked, she realized with a shock that went all the way to her bones, exactly like a frightened animal trapped in a cage. "What are you suggesting, Specialist?" Marcus set down his coffee and straightened his uniform. "I am suggesting, Commander, that we try something the Coalition never thought to do in 3,000 years. "And what is that?" He smiled. It was the smile of a man from Wisconsin who had once coaxed a feral wolf to eat from his hand. "I am going to go say hello." Commander Sarah Chun stood in the observation room with her arms crossed and her heart pounding as she watched Marcus Webb do the most insane thing she had ever witnessed in 20 years of space service. He had removed his hazmat suit. Every protocol in the Coalition's handbook demanded full protective gear when dealing with a HFY. And here was her specialist walking into the containment area in nothing but his standard uniform, as casual as a man taking a stroll through a park back on Earth. "Marcus, this is suicide," she said through the intercom, her voice tight with fear. "With respect, Commander, the hazmat suits are not going to protect anyone from a creature that can eat stars. If it wants to kill me, it will kill me regardless of what I am wearing." He had a point, but Sarah did not like it one bit. The HFY, still pressed against the far wall of the containment bay, turned several of its many eyes toward the approaching human. Its quantum fire flickered and pulsed, casting shadows that moved in ways that hurt to look at. Marcus stopped about 15 feet away and sat down on the cold metal floor. "What are you doing?" Sarah demanded. "I am not being threatening," Marcus replied, and he pulled a sandwich from his pocket, unwrapping it with the calm patience of a man who had all the time in the universe. "Predators respond to body language, Commander. If I stand tall and move fast and stare directly at it, that reads as aggression. But if I sit down and make myself small and ignore it, that reads as peaceful. That thing is not a predator, Marcus. It is a weapon of mass destruction. Every weapon was something else first. He took a bite of his sandwich and began to talk, not to Sarah, but to the creature watching him with burning eyes. "You know, this reminds me of a wolf we had back at the rescue center in Wisconsin. Mean old thing had been abused for years before we got her. Everyone said she could not be saved, that she was too far gone, too dangerous." The Vethkai made a sound low and rumbling, and the containment field sensors registered it as a threat display. Marcus kept talking. "I spent 3 months just sitting outside her enclosure, reading books and eating lunch, never trying to touch her or even look at her directly. Some of the other techs thought I was wasting my time, but I knew she just needed to understand that not everyone was going to hurt her." Sarah watched the readings on her console with growing disbelief. The creature's aggression metrics were dropping, slowly but steadily, like water draining from a tub. One day she came up to the fence and just sat there, looking at me. I did not move, did not react, just kept reading my book. The next day she did it again, and the day after that she brought me a stick. The Vethkai shifted, its massive form uncurling slightly from its defensive position against the wall. Her name was Luna, and by the end of that year, she was the sweetest thing you ever saw. She just needed someone to be patient with her, someone to show her that the world was not all pain and fear. Marcus finished his sandwich and wiped his hands on his pants, still not looking directly at the creature. "I do not know what happened to you, big guy. I do not know what they did to make you or what they made you do after, but I am not here to hurt you. I am just here to sit with you, if that is okay." The quantum fire around the Vethkai dimmed, just a little, and Sarah held her breath as she watched something impossible unfold. Over the next 3 days, Marcus returned again and again, always sitting in the same spot, always talking in that same calm voice about nothing in particular. He talked about his grandmother's farm and the smell of fresh hay. He talked about his daughter's graduation and how proud he had been. He talked about baseball and bad movies and the way coffee tasted better in space for some reason. The Vethkai listened. Sarah did not know how she knew it was listening, but she did. Those too many eyes tracked Marcus whenever he moved, and the creature's body language shifted from terror to wariness to something that almost looked like curiosity. On the 4th day, the Vethkai moved. It crossed the containment bay in a flowing motion that made Sarah's eyes water, and it stopped 10 feet from where Marcus sat, closer than it had ever allowed anyone to approach. "Well, hello there," Marcus said, and he smiled without showing his teeth, because showing teeth was aggression in most species. "Nice to meet you properly. I think I am going to call you Nix, if that is all right. It means night, and you kind of remind me of the night sky, all dark and full of stars." The creature made a sound, not the screaming assault from before, but something softer, almost questioning. "Nix it is then." On the 5th day, Marcus noticed something that changed everything. He was studying the sensor readings on his datapad, comparing them to the biological databases the Coalition had provided when he found a discrepancy. "Commander," he called over the intercom, excitement in his voice. "The Coalition's files say that the Vethkai have no social behaviors, that they are solitary predators with no need for companionship. But these readings do not match that at all." "What do you mean?" "There is a dense cluster of nerve endings along the lower thorax, almost like a secondary sensory organ, but it is not set up for hunting or navigation. The structure is identical to bonding receptors I have seen in social species, the kind that respond to physical contact from trusted individuals." Sarah frowned at her own console. The Coalition has been studying these creatures for 3,000 years. How could they miss something like that? "Because they were not looking for it," Marcus replied, and there was sadness in his voice now. "They made these creatures to be weapons, so they only looked for weapon-related biology. They never considered that the Vethkai might have been made from something that needed connection and love." He looked at Nyx, and the creature looked back at him with eyes that burned like dying suns. The species they were engineered from went extinct before the Vethkai were ever used. These creatures have been alone for 3,000 years, Commander. Alone and frightened and hurting, with no one who even thought to ask if they were okay. Sarah felt something twist in her chest, something that might have been guilt for a crime that happened long before she was born. What are you going to do? Marcus stood up slowly, brushing off his pants, and took a careful step toward Nyx. I'm going to do what I should have done on day one. He reached out his hand, palm up, and waited. Nyx stared at him for a long moment, quantum fire flickering uncertainly. Then, slowly, impossibly, the creature that could end worlds lowered its massive head and pressed it against the human's tiny hand. Hey there, buddy, Marcus whispered, and his voice was thick with emotion. It is okay. You are not alone anymore. He moved his hand along the creature's form, searching, until he found that cluster of nerve endings along the lower thorax, and he scratched gently. Nyx made a sound that the translation software could only describe as contentment purring, and the galaxy killer flopped onto its side like an oversized cat. Commander, Marcus said, and he was laughing now, laughing with tears in his eyes. I think it likes belly rubs. News traveled fast in the Galactic Coalition, and the news from Armstrong Station traveled faster than anything had in centuries. A human had tamed a Vethkai. Within days, every species in the galaxy was talking about it. Some were fascinated, sending messages of congratulation and requests for more information. Others were horrified, calling it a perversion of the natural order and demanding that the experiment be terminated immediately. But no one was more upset than the Kethver. Ascendancy. The Kethver had risen to power 2,000 years ago specifically because they controlled the deployment of the Vethkai. They were the only species trusted to manage the containment pods, the only ones with access codes to the stasis fields, and their position in the coalition depended entirely on everyone else being too afraid to challenge them. Now a soft, squishy human from a backwater planet was scratching a galaxy killer's belly while it made happy noises. And the Kethver could see their entire power structure crumbling. High Commander Vexthos of the Kethver Military Council stared at the intelligence reports with growing fury. The humans had done more in 2 weeks than the Coalition had managed in 3 millennia. And they had done it with kindness rather than force. This could not be allowed to continue. Assemble a strike team, he ordered his subordinate, his voice cold as the void between stars. Elite soldiers only. I want Armstrong Station neutralized and every trace of this abomination erased. Sir, that would be an act of war against the humans. It will look like an accident. Containment failure, tragic loss of life. The Vethkai went berserk and had to be destroyed. No one will question it, and the natural order will be restored. The strike team launched 3 days later in a ship equipped with weapons capable of cracking planets. Meanwhile, on Armstrong Station, Marcus Webb had no idea that death was speeding toward him through the darkness of space. He was too busy teaching Nyx how to play. The Vethkai had turned out to be remarkably intelligent, understanding concepts and responding to commands with a speed that amazed everyone. It could not speak in ways that humans could hear, but it communicated through movements and sounds and the subtle flickering of its quantum fire. Okay, Nyx, watch the ball, Marcus said, holding up a glowing sphere that the engineering team had designed to survive the creature's touch. Nyx focused, all 17 of its eyes on the ball, with an intensity that would have been terrifying if it were not so adorable. Marcus threw the ball across the containment bay. Nyx bounded after it, its massive form moving with surprising grace, and caught the ball in a tendril of darkness before it could hit the far wall. Then it turned and brought the ball back, dropping it at Marcus's feet with a sound that everyone on the station had started calling the Happy Rumble. Good job. Muddy, Marcus laughed, scratching that spot behind Nix's third eye cluster that made its back leg kick. Commander Chun watched from the observation deck with a smile on her face that she could not have imagined wearing 2 weeks ago. She had grown fond of the creature, fond of the way it followed Marcus around the station like an enormous eldritch puppy. The other crew members had warmed up to Nix as well. Lieutenant Park brought it treats from the kitchen, strange combinations of minerals and energy that the Vethkai seemed to enjoy. Ensign Rodriguez had started reading to it during the night shift, and the creature would curl up and listen with its eyes half closed. For the first time in its long and terrible existence, the Galaxy Killer knew what it felt like to have a family. The Kethver strike team arrived at 0300 station time, when most of the crew was asleep. They cut through the outer hull with surgical precision, bypassing alarms that they had designed themselves centuries ago. 12 elite soldiers in combat armor moved through the corridors like ghosts, heading for the containment bay where their target slumbered. Marcus was still there, having fallen asleep in his usual spot near Nix. He often stayed late, talking to the creature until exhaustion took him, and Nix had learned to be quiet and still while its human rested. The strike team found them like that, a tiny man sleeping peacefully beside a monster that could unmake reality. Disgusting. The team leader spat, raising his plasma rifle. Marcus woke to the sound of heavy footsteps and alien voices, and his eyes went wide as he saw the armed soldiers surrounding him. "What is this?" he demanded, scrambling to his feet. "This is the restoration of order," the team leader replied, his weapon trained on Marcus's chest. "You have disrupted the natural balance of the galaxy, human. You have taken a weapon of unimaginable power and turned it into a pet. This cannot be allowed. Nix is not a weapon. Nix is a living creature that deserves kindness and respect. It is a tool, nothing more, and tools that malfunction must be destroyed." Marcus stepped in front of Nix, spreading his arms as if his fragile human body could protect the being of cosmic destruction. "I will not let you hurt my friend." The team leader laughed. "A cold and ugly sound. Your friend? Human, that thing has eaten more stars than you have seen in your entire life. It has burned civilizations to ash and ended billions of lives. It does not have friends. It does not have feelings. It is a monster. You are wrong, am I? Then let me show you what your friend really is." He aimed his rifle at Marcus and prepared to fire, knowing that the Vethkai would react to its handler's death, knowing that the resulting rampage would justify everything they were about to do. But the team leader had made a terrible mistake. He had assumed that Nix was like the other Vethkai, mindless and driven only by rage. He had assumed that 3,000 years of programming could not be undone by a few weeks of kindness. He had assumed that the Galaxy Killer did not understand what was happening. Nix understood everything. Nix had been listening and learning since the day Marcus first sat down with his sandwich. Nix had watched the humans interact and had figured out their language and their customs and their strange but wonderful way of caring for things that could not care for themselves. And Nix had learned something that no Vethkai had ever learned before, what it meant to love. The creature moved faster than the eye could follow, faster than thought itself, and the strike team found themselves engulfed in quantum fire and living darkness. Their weapons, capable of destroying continents, melted like ice in a furnace. Their armor, designed to withstand the worst the universe could throw at them, crumbled like paper in a hurricane. Nix did not kill them all. The creature had learned mercy from its human pack, but it did eat their ship, consuming the vessel that had carried them here in a display of power that left no doubt about who was really in charge. When it was over, when the surviving soldiers lay unconscious on the floor in restraints made of solidified darkness, Nyx returned to Marcus and made that happy rumble sound. Marcus reached up with trembling hands and scratched the spot that made Nyx purr. "Good job, buddy," he whispered, and his voice was shaking with relief and gratitude and love. "Good job protecting the pack." Nyx flopped onto its side, 17 eyes closed in contentment, and the Galaxy Killer, who had just defeated an elite strike team, without breaking a sweat, kicked its back leg happily while its human gave it belly rubs. Commander Chun, who had been woken by alarms and had watched the entire confrontation from the observation deck, sat down heavily in her chair. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" she muttered. But she was smiling as she said it. The Galactic Coalition had not seen a crisis this severe in 500 years. An entire Kethra strike cruiser had vanished. 12 elite soldiers had been captured, and the humans were claiming self-defense against an unprovoked attack. Meanwhile, the Kethra Ascendancy was demanding immediate extermination of both the Vethkai and what they called the human contamination. Emergency sessions were called, ambassadors were recalled from distant postings, and the Grand Council chamber filled with representatives from every major species in the galaxy. Admiral Kethros watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of guilt and fascination. He had started this experiment expecting it to fail, expecting the humans to be humbled and put in their place. And instead they had shattered assumptions that the Coalition had held for millennia. The Kethra representative, a towering figure with scales the color of dried blood, stood before the assembly and pointed an accusatory claw at the human delegation. "These creatures have corrupted a strategic asset," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the chamber. "They have taken a weapon of the Coalition and turned it against our own people. This is an act of war." Commander Sarah Chun rose to respond, her voice calm despite the fury being directed at her. "Your soldiers invaded our station in the middle of the night with weapons drawn. They threatened to kill one of my crew. The Vethkai was defending its handler, nothing more. The Vethkai does not have handlers. It is not a pet. It is a tool of annihilation that these humans have somehow perverted." "Perhaps," Sarah replied. "The Vethkai has always been more than a tool, and you were simply too afraid to find out." The chamber erupted in shouting, different species taking different sides, old alliances straying under the weight of new revelations. It was Admiral Kethros who finally restored order, rising from his seat with all 4 arms raised for silence. "There is one way to settle this," he said, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too much to be intimidated by politics. "Let us ask the Vethkai itself." Silence fell across the chamber. "That is impossible," the Kethra representative sputtered. "The creatures cannot be controlled outside of containment. It would be suicide to bring one here. The humans seem to have found a way. Let them demonstrate." All eyes turned to Commander Chun, who felt the weight of a galaxy's attention pressing down on her. She thought of Marcus and Nyx, of the bond that had formed between a man from Wisconsin and a being of cosmic destruction. She thought of the way Nyx followed Marcus around the station, of the happy rumbles and the belly rubs, and the way 17 burning eyes could somehow look gentle and trusting. "We will do it," she said. 3 days later, the Grand Council chamber was evacuated of all non-essential personnel. Species that had attended every session for centuries fled to observation galleries behind reinforced shields. Even the bravest warriors found excuses to be elsewhere. Only the most senior representatives remained, and most of them were visibly trembling. The great doors opened, and Marcus Webb walked in. He was wearing his standard uniform, the same clothes he wore when feeding Nyx treats or playing fetch in the containment bay. He had refused all offers of armor or protection, saying that it would send the wrong message. Behind him, filling the doorway and then some, came Nyx. The Vethkai flowed into the chamber like a river of darkness and starlight. its quantum fire casting impossible shadows on walls that had stood for 10,000 years. It was enormous, far larger than the recordings had suggested, and its presence made the air itself feel heavy with power. Several representatives fainted on the spot. The HFY delegate, to his credit, held his ground, though his scales had gone pale with fear. "You see," he said, his voice only slightly unsteady, "this is what we have been warning about. Look at this monster. Look at what it could do to all of us." Nyx turned those 17 burning eyes toward him, and the HFY went silent. But the creature did not attack. Instead, it looked at Marcus as if asking permission, and when Marcus nodded, Nyx lowered its massive form and lay down at his feet. The image was impossible to deny. A galaxy killer, a being that had eaten suns and ended civilizations, resting peacefully beside a human like a loyal hound waiting for its master's command. Admiral Kethros rose to speak, and his voice was heavy with the weight of confession. "I owe this assembly an apology," he began, "and I owe the humans an explanation. When I proposed sending a HFY to Armstrong Station, I did not expect success. I expected the humans to fail, to be frightened and overwhelmed, to learn their place in the hierarchy of the coalition." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. "Instead, they taught me something that we should have learned 3,000 years ago. The HFY were never uncontrollable. They were never mindless weapons. They were traumatized creatures, created for violence and denied connection, driven mad by millennia of isolation." He turned to look at Nyx, and there was something like wonder in his ancient eyes. The humans did not have some mystical power. They simply looked at something terrifying and asked what it needed. They offered kindness where we offered only fear, and in return, they received loyalty beyond anything we could have imagined. The HFY representative stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "This is propaganda. This is manipulation. These humans have clearly found some way to control the creature's mind. We cannot allow this to stand." Nyx raised its head and stared at him. The representative went very, very quiet. "The HFY are not controlled," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since entering the chamber. "Nyx is here because Nyx chooses to be here. Nyx follows me because Nyx trusts me. And Nyx protected me because Nyx loves me, as much as I love Nyx." He reached down and scratched that spot behind the third eye cluster, and Nyx made the happy rumble that had become so familiar to everyone on Armstrong Station. "For 3,000 years, you treated these creatures as weapons," Marcus continued. "You created them from social species, beings that needed connection and companionship. And then you locked them in isolation and wondered why they went mad. You called them monsters because you made them into monsters." He looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives, at beings from 100 different worlds with 100 different histories. "The real question is not what we did. The real question is, what are you going to do now? Are you going to keep living in fear of creatures that just want to be loved? Or are you going to help us fix the mistake that was made 3 millennia ago?" Silence held the chamber in its grip. Then Admiral Kethros began to applaud, his four hands creating a rhythm that echoed off the ancient walls. One by one, other representatives joined in, until the sound of approval filled the Grand Council chamber like a wave. The HFY representative stood alone, surrounded by a galaxy that had finally chosen compassion over fear. The tribunal ruled in humanity's favor by an overwhelming margin. Nyx celebrated by rolling onto its back and demanding belly rubs in front of the entire Galactic Coalition, and Marcus was happy to oblige. 1 year had passed since the tribunal that changed the galaxy. Armstrong Station had been transformed beyond recognition. What was once a small research outpost orbiting Earth had become the HFY Rehabilitation Center, the largest undertaking in Coalition history. 17 containment pods had been transported from the darkest corners of space. 17 galaxy killers who had spent millennia alone and afraid. And now humanity had taken on the impossible task of healing them all. Marcus Webb stood on the observation deck, watching as a team of specialists worked with a Vethkai designated VK-14, now called Storm by its handlers. The creature was making progress, responding to vocal cues and accepting treats, though it still flinched whenever someone moved too quickly. "How is Storm doing today?" Commander Chun asked, joining him at the window. "Better. She let Dr. Rodriguez touch her for the first time yesterday. It took 6 months to get there, but we knew she would need more time than Nix did." Sarah nodded, remembering the files they had received on Storm's history. The creature had been deployed more times than any other Vethkai, used to destroy 17 solar systems before the wars ended, and the trauma ran deep. "Not all of them are going to make it," she said quietly. Marcus sighed, and there was sadness in his eyes but also determination. "No, probably not. VK-07 is still completely unresponsive, and VK-12 has violent episodes that we cannot predict. Some of them might be too damaged, too lost in the pain of what was done to them. Does that mean we should stop trying? Never. We keep trying until we have exhausted every option, and then we try some more. That is what it means to be human." The rehabilitation center had attracted attention from across the galaxy. Some species sent observers to learn from humanity's methods, hoping to apply the same principles to other challenges they faced. Others sent resources and funding, wanting to support the work, even if they could not participate directly. The Kethver Ascendancy had collapsed within months of the tribunal. Without their monopoly on the Vethkai, their power base crumbled, and the species that had once dominated through fear found themselves rebuilding from the ground up. Some of them had even joined the rehabilitation effort, seeking redemption for generations of cruelty. But not everyone was happy about the new order. Factions still existed that saw humanity's success as a threat. They whispered in dark corners about the danger of a species that could tame galaxy killers. They warned that the humans were building an army of living weapons that would conquer the universe. Marcus had heard the rumors and had laughed at them. "If they think we are building weapons, they have not been paying attention," he told a group of coalition journalists who visited the station. "We are not training the Vethkai to fight. We are teaching them to trust. There is a difference." To prove his point, he had taken them to meet Nix. The galaxy killer was lounging in the habitat bay that had been built specifically for its comfort. A massive space filled with artificial stars and cosmic dust that reminded the creature of the deep space it came from. When the journalists entered, it raised its head and made the happy rumble that everyone had learned to recognize. "This is Nix," Marcus said, scratching that spot behind the third eye cluster. "Nix, these are friends." The creature studied the journalists with 17 burning eyes, and several of them looked ready to flee. But then Nix did something that left them all speechless. It offered them a ball. The same glowing sphere that Marcus had used for their first game of fetch was held out in a tendril of darkness, an invitation to play. "Nix has been practicing sharing," Marcus explained with a grin. "We are working on social skills. Apparently 3,000 years of isolation leaves you a bit rusty when it comes to making friends." One brave journalist, a small creature from a species known for their curiosity, reached out and took the ball. Nix made an excited sound and backed up, clearly waiting for it to be thrown. The journalist threw the ball. Nix bounded after it, quantum fire trailing behind like a comet's tail, and caught it before it could hit the far wall. The creature returned and dropped the ball at the journalist's feet, then flopped onto its side with a hopeful look. "I think Nix wants belly rubs," Marcus said. The journalist, hands trembling, reached out and scratched the dense cluster of nerve endings along Nix's lower thorax. The galaxy killer's back leg kicked, and a purr rumbled through the habitat bay like distant thunder. The video of that moment spread across the galaxy within hours. Watching it, Admiral Kethros felt something he had not felt in centuries: hope. He had lived long enough to see wars and peace and everything in between. He had watched species rise and fall, had witnessed the creation of the Vethkai and the terror they inspired. He had thought he understood how the universe worked, but the humans had proven him wrong in the best possible way. "They are not like any species we have encountered," he told his aide. Watching the video for the 10th time, they do not conquer through strength or intimidate through power. They simply refuse to accept that anything is beyond saving. Is that not dangerous, sir? To have that much optimism in a universe this cruel? Perhaps, the Admiral replied. Or perhaps it is exactly what this universe has needed all along. On the observation deck of the Rehabilitation Center, Marcus Webb watched as another Vethkai took its first tentative steps toward trusting a human. Her name was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a trauma specialist who had spent 20 years helping abused animals on Earth, before joining the Coalition's Xenobiology Division. She was patient and kind, and had a gift for reaching creatures that others had given up on. The Vethkai she was working with, VK03 or Ember, as the team had named it, had made more progress in 3 months than anyone expected. Today, it had eaten a treat directly from her hand for the first time. "Good job, Ember," Dr. Tanaka said softly, and the creature's quantum fire flickered in what might have been pleasure. Marcus smiled and turned away, leaving the specialist to her work. He found Nix waiting for him in the corridor, the Galaxy Killer having learned to navigate the station's passages without damaging anything important. 17 eyes focused on him with what he could only describe as affection. "Hey, buddy, want to go watch the stars?" Nix made the happy rumble. They went to the observation deck, the big one with windows that looked out on infinity, and they sat together in comfortable silence. Nix curled around Marcus like a protective shell of darkness and fire, and Marcus leaned against his friend's side and watched the universe turn. Out there, somewhere, species were still afraid of what humanity had done. They did not understand that the Galaxy Killers were not weapons anymore, that they never had to be weapons again. But fear faded with time, and understanding grew, and someday even the most frightened species would look at Nix and see what Marcus had seen from the beginning. A creature that just wanted to be loved. "You know what, Nix?" Marcus said softly. The creature made an inquiring sound. "I think we are going to be okay. All of us, humans and Vethkai, and everyone else in this crazy galaxy. As long as there are people willing to sit down with monsters and ask what they need, there is hope." Nix rumbled in agreement and snuggled closer. Outside the window, the stars burned eternal, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the Galaxy Killers were at peace. Marcus scratched that special spot, and his friend kicked its back leg happily, and together they watched the dawn of a new era rise across the universe.